So that's why it's fun talk as opposed to practice changing talk.
We're recording this, by the way. Yeah.
Or interesting case study. Anyway, so I'm going to bring another person. I read two very interesting books, one called Mosquitoes in Human History and one called Pathogenesis, which is how germs changed human history. And I was influenced by the mosquito one. I don't know which came first, the germ or the mosquito, but the mosquito one interested me. And so I've based this on that, but I've also got a few extra bits and pieces in it. So this is what Timothy Weingard writes. Forgive me, I'm going to be reading a little bit from the slides because they're a bit full, because I was worried I was going to forget stuff. He writes, the mosquito has ambushed humankind with unmitigated fury since time immemorial and scratched her indelible mark on the modern world order. And hopefully I will show you a few examples of that. So we'll start with an introduction, then we'll go into a bit of entomology, look at how some genetics of humans from our hominid times have changed because of mosquito illnesses. Then have a look at slavery and warfare, and I've just chosen 3 wars. I tried to space them apart, and then some timelines, and then just very briefly in the modern era.
How about that actual draw?
Yeah, I didn't think. Sorry, I probably should have because it's. I'm sure it was influenced. So mosquitoes are found everywhere except for the Antarctic, Iceland, and some French Polynesian islands. I mean, they're found deep in mines. They're also found up high in the Himalayas. So they really are ubiquitous. And the Gates Foundation book, it's actually Bill Gates. He has a very nice blog where he recommends books and all sorts of things. I don't know if he blogs so much since the Jeffrey Epstein file, but he was blogging, and he has a list of animals most dangerous to humans, and the mosquito comes top of it. Sharks, which they always publish in the papers. I don't know if it's because the paper I read has got an Australian branch, are number 50. And then we get World Mosquito Day, which is on the 20th of August, which in 1897 was the day that Ronald Ross found that the female Anopheles transmits malaria. So that's World Mosquito Day. So the mosquitoes are basically the big family is Culicidae, and they're divided up into the Anophelines and the Culicines. These are the medically important mosquitoes. And the Anophelines are Anopheles species, of which there are about 300. And in the Culicines, there are also loads of species, Culex, Mansonia, Aedes, which is the one we're going to talk a lot about, Haemogogus, and Sabetes. And the Anophelines transmit malaria, filariasis, and quite a few arboviruses. I didn't go into all arboviruses they transmit. And the Culicines, some Culex species do transmit filariasis as well in the form of Wuchereria bancrofti, but also arboviruses. And the one we're really interested in is yellow fever. And it's going to be yellow fever and malaria, which play a big part in our story, not so much dengue. So here's just a few pictures of Anopheles mosquitoes. To identify them, you'll see that Anophelines, the heads are in line with their abdomen, their thumbs are up when they're at rest or they're feeding. They lay their eggs singly, and they have little rafts at the side of their eggs, and they lay them on the surface of the water. And their larvae also are parallel to the surface of the water, where they have little spiracles where they get oxygen. The pupae look much the same in all the species of Anopheles. Those are of all the species of mosquito. Those are those comma-shaped animals you see there. And just to note that the eggs can't survive desiccation very well. Then you get Aedes mosquitoes. Now I've put in the new names, but people don't refer to them by their new names because it's like our fungi. It's just everyone knows it by their old names. So the new names is Stegomyia aegypti, which is Aedes aegypti, and then Ochlorotatus albopictus. And to tell the difference between Aegypti and albopictus, you can see on the thorax of Aegyptius, it's got a lyre-shaped white stripes, like a lyre, like an ancient Greece. And whereas albopictus has just got a straight line. And they lay their eggs singly. Some species lay them on the surface of the water. Other species lay them clinging to the sides of containers. And they can withstand desiccation. And the problem is if they cling to the sides of containers, then they'll withstand desiccation if you enter the container, but when you flood it again, they can then hatch. And their larvae, their pupae look the same, but their larvae hang sort of straight down with that top bit being called the siphon, which they get the air. And the various species have siphons of different lengths. So, how have mosquitoes affected human genetics? Well, this is really a story of malaria, and they say malaria has exerted one of the strongest identifiable selective pressures on the human genome out of all diseases. And you can see sickle cell disease, that's predominantly in Africa, and it arose 7,500 years ago, mainly due to infection due to Plasmodium falciparum. Whereas Duffy coat antigen negativity, that's a much older trait from 97,000 years ago due to Plasmodium vivax. And these two maps just show on the right-hand side the Duffy coat antigen negativity, which is predominantly in Central Africa. And then on the left-hand side where vivax is endemic, and you'll see it's not endemic in Central Africa. There are also other traits like G6PD deficiency, and I think the O blood antigen, which also makes it difficult for malaria to penetrate the red blood cell. But these are the main two. You can all interrupt if you know you've got something better to say. Okay. So let's now start off with history and look at transatlantic slavery. Now, this picture over here shows you the volumes of transatlantic slavery. Most slavery was transatlantic from about the 1600s all the way to the late 1900s. And transatlantic from Angola up to what they call the Gold Coast and Cameroon. And they went to South America and parts of North America too, as well as the islands in between, Caribbean and Cuba and whatnot. There was some Eastern slavery, but that was in a far less number, and those slaves weren't chattel slaves like the slaves the people they captured on to go transatlantic into the plantations. And I'm sure you all know this, there's a picture of a slave ship, and you can see how people are squashed one body next to another, chained on the lower decks of ships. And these ships were the ideal conditions for the transfer of mosquitoes from the coasts, the west coast of Africa, because they had barrels of water on board, plus a great concentration of people to feed on. But what they have found that looking at South America and North America, most likely Vivax was introduced by the European settlers, the very first people to colonize, like Columbus and all of them. But falciparum seems to have come and become endemic in those countries with the slaves, as well as yellow fever. And African slaves, if they were so-called seasoned, they survived the voyage and managed to be healthy. They got quite a higher price at auction because they were immune to diseases that the European settlers would not have been, like the yellow fever and the Plasmodium falciparum. And you must remember, at the same time, there were some Europeans going across. I think it was especially the Irish, who were indentured laborers. And they would work for like a 7-year contract and then be given some land or some money. But they didn't actually survive in these conditions so much as the captive people from Africa. And the plantations on which they worked were for sugar, tobacco, cotton, also coffee, and large numbers of people, especially sugar, are needed to cultivate and refine out the sugar from the sugar cane. And it's thought that that's probably why in the western part, because you had so many more people as opposed to eastern slavery, why, for instance, yellow fever became endemic in the Americas, but not in the East, where dengue is the predominant virus. I think it might just be sheer numbers. It's up for debate, though. They don't know why. So what about conflicts and mosquitoes? Now, this is a picture called This is Anne, and Anne is a novelist. And it's actually Dr. I don't know if you pronounce it soy sauce. Anyway, he was like a propaganda chap during the war and made posters for the troops. And here you can see a sort of mosquito who's got that funny little tuft of hair, which looks a lot like the Grinch and whatnot. But this was just to remind the troops to use their mosquito repellents and their bed nets. A lot of the posters were actually much more suggestive than this and had a lot of naked women all over them. But I couldn't find any on Google. They were in the books, but not on Google. Anyway. Okay. So we're going to start off in the ancient world, ancient Europe and ancient North Africa. And we're going to start off with the Second Punic War. Now, the Punic Wars were the wars, the First and the Second Punic War were the wars between two equally important powers around the Mediterranean at that time, which was Carthage and Rome. Now, what had happened in the First Punic War, Hamilcar, who was the father of Hannibal, lost Sicily and a large portion of his territory to the Romans. So in the Second Punic War, his son Hannibal decided to avenge him. And that's when he made his famous journey across the Alps with a whole lot of soldiers. There were about 40,000 men and 37 elephants. And I think only about 5 elephants survived the crossing. And what happened was he appeared in northern Italy in about 218 BCE. And he had some early victories, and the Romans were quite taken aback. He was quite successful. But then there ended up being a war of attrition, because as Hannibal made his way down into more southern parts of Italy, he encountered malaria, and that malaria was from the Pontine Marshes, which was a huge expanse, stretching from the east coast all the way to Rome. and other low-lying marshes where they had malaria. And so a lot of his troops became very sick. A lot of them died. Um, and so by the time he may have been successful, but he had to give it up because he had no army left or anything to fight the Romans. So the Romans slowly gained control and then cut off Hannibal from his reinforcements. And that's just a picture there. I rather like it. So I like Turner, of Turner's picture of Hannibal crossing the Alps, and you can just at the bottom make out like an elephant's butt. It's mainly about to show the terrible conditions he had to endure. So then Hannibal was in Italy, but then Scipio Africanus, a Roman general, took over Carthage, and Hannibal was recalled to fight Scipio Africanus. And unfortunately, though, he lost because his once mighty army was a shadow of its former self. And it was at the Battle of Zama in 202 BC that he was defeated. And so the legacy is that you could argue, with Timothy Weingart argues, I agree with it, let's put it this way, that because of mosquitoes, Rome came to dominate the ancient world as opposed to North Africa or Carthage. And you can think of what an influence that has had on all our civilizations since. Then the American Revolution, which is one I think Donald Trump would quite enjoy. And this was mainly between the Continental Army, or the Americans under George Washington, and they sided, the French were with them against the British colonizers. And falciparum malaria, due to the slave trade, which was happening sort of contemporaneously, was endemic to southern colonies, especially the Carolinas, Virginia, and Georgia. And the local populations of those had partial immunity, whereas the invading British didn't. So once again, the invaders and some of the northern soldiers who were fighting with Britain lost out. And when Britain shifted its focus to the south, where malaria was rampant, they all succumbed to malaria, and so their armies were much diminished. And they say that the mosquito was one of Washington's greatest allies. And then finally, in 1781, at the siege of Yorktown in Virginia, the British army under Cornwallis was weakened by Virginia and surrendered. And we got the Declaration of Independence and American independence, and America ending up as we know it. Then lastly, well, not second lastly, I'm going to look at the Haitian Revolution. I think this is very interesting because we often think of, especially in the Americas, we think of slaves as being very passive, letting all terrible things being done to them, but this wasn't always the case. They did revolt. And the Haitian Revolution was one of those. And Haiti in those days was called Saint Domingo, and it was a French colony. And it was its richest colony, producing sugar and coffee. And it relied on the enslaved African labor, often working under brutal conditions. And they had brought along, and the environment was perfect for malaria and yellow fever to thrive. And they've called this the Columbian Exchange, where Columbus he took the gold and everything back with him to Portugal and Spain, but left behind all the diseases. So the Haitian Revolution was inspired due to the French Revolution's ideals of liberty and equality. And in 1791, the enslaved people rose up against the French plantation owners. And it was led by a former slave who had been manumitted. And he was an educated man, and his name was Toussaint Louverture. I think, if I'm sorry, I don't have much French. Le chat est sur le boîte. And that's about it. Okay, anyway. But that's a picture of him up there. And he was an educated man and former slave, and he emerged as a key leader. And in 1793 to 1798, the British and Spanish forces tried to seize the colony, and tens of thousands died from fever. And then in 1892, when Napoleon came in, despite his ideals, he thought slavery was a jolly good idea, and he wanted to reassert slavery in their provinces. And he sent 40,000 French troops under General Leclerc, but to retake control. But unfortunately, malaria and yellow fever decimated his armies, and 85% of them died. So after 13 years of battle, Louverture didn't survive. He eventually got hanged, but he had some successes. But Haiti eventually gained independence after 13 years. And a side thing was that the troops that had been fighting there, the French and the British and the Spanish, when they went up to North America, they took the mosquito-borne diseases with them. So it was another introduction into North America of those mosquito-borne diseases. And they even took them back to Europe. And in the Netherlands, they described yellow fever as vomito negro. It's Spanish meaning black vomit, which you can see from the hemorrhagic fever. So what about World War II? Well, Italy's lowland and river valleys, from the River Po up north to the Pontine marshes, I'll show you them on the map, were were infested with malaria. And in fact, Caesar had wanted to drain the Pontine marshes, Julius Caesar, but then he was killed before he could do it. And it took Mussolini, like almost 2,000 years later, to drain them. And for him, it was a great patriotic thing in a battle for land. But then, unfortunately, with the invasion of the Allies, when the Germans withdrew from Italy, because we invaded from the south, and the Allies, and the Germans went from the north, they re-flooded the Pontine marshes. So that brought back malaria and destroyed the malaria control systems. And this is considered one of the first uses of biological warfare via the environment. Remember that they had biological warfare from what?
That way from the siege of
Oh, okay, that's right. When they flung the bodies over the wall. Yeah. But this was one of the first ones which had to do with the environment. And the civilians and allied troops were hit by massive malaria outbreaks. And that's when the army stepped in, and they got the Army School of Malariology. And what they did was they tried to drain, do larvicides, and do DDT. And they literally used to douse the soldiers with DDT. I don't know if they would do it. They also did distribution of quinine and atabrine to the troops. And it created a marked shift to organized military vector control than what had been happening before. And malaria outbreaks unfortunately slowed the Allied advances to Rome, and there was an awful lot of civilian suffering. But eventually the marshes were drained again, and as we know, malaria is no longer in Italy. around Rome. And there's just one of the other posters, which is sort of suggestive, but not quite mosquito. Don't go to bed with a malaria mosquito. And these were the posters that bombarded the soldiers, particularly the American soldiers. So just now looking at some timelines, firstly of mosquitoes and malaria and discovery. I'm gonna read this one quite a bit because I can't remember all the dates. In 1623, there was a papal conclave, which was actually decimated by malaria. 10 cardinals died, and many other Romans died. And so in 1631, a Jesuit apothecary working in Peru sent back bark from the cinchona tree to Rome because he had noted that the locals used it to treat fevers. There were early in 1643 some trials, I don't know what those trials encompassed, of cinchona bark in Rome. But then about 100 years later, in 1747, Linnaeus named the tree genus cinchona. But it was only in 1820 that quinine was isolated from the cinchona bark. And that was fine. Now they had a potential treatment, but they still didn't know the cause and the transmission of malaria. And so Charles Louis Alphonse Laveran, he was working in Algeria, an army doctor, and he described malaria parasites in the blood of a sick soldier. So they knew it was a bloodborne and it was a parasite, but they didn't know how it was transmitted. And that's where Ronald Ross came in. And he was working out in India. I forget the exact place where he was working. And he worked out the malaria cycle in sparrows. He could only work it out in sparrows, and he said perhaps he's using the wrong type of mosquito for humans. And I've got in my head, I don't know if it's true, but I think I've read it somewhere, that it was actually his lab tech who suggested that it was the mosquito that was transmitting the malaria, not him. But I didn't put that down on the slides because I don't know if it's true, but I've read that somewhere, but I can't pinpoint where I've read it. But it was if it's true, it's a good example of a colonial person taking the credit for something that a local person said. And then in 1898, 3 Italians described the cycle of human malaria in the Anopheles mosquito. Finally, in 1900, Manson confirmed that mosquito malaria transmission happens in humans, and that's Manson at the top. And then a few years later, in 1904 and 1914, the American military sent Gorgas down to William Gorgas, he sounds Spanish, but I think he was actually from the United States, to control malaria and yellow fever so that they could build the Panama Canal. They had tried, but it was unsuccessful due to the high rates of death of the workers. And then what about the discovery of yellow fever? Well, it starts off in 1648, the first reported outbreak in the Yucatan in Mexico. But at that time, rather like initially with malaria from being malaria, so they also thought that yellow fever was due to miasmata and whatnot. Then in 1868 and 1895, the Cuban revolts against Spanish colonizers, because Cuba revolts against Spanish colonizers. Cuba was the province of Spain, and it had enough and it revolted. But many troops that they were sent from Spain died of yellow fever, the locals having been seasoned. And for every soldier in battle, 13 died of yellow fever. So so you can see it exerted a high toll. And so in the 1890s to 1900, the United States decided to play a greater role in Cuba. They were interested in the sugar production from Cuba. But they had to somehow control epidemics of yellow fever, which would spring up even in places where the sugar was exported to, like New Orleans and the Mississippi Valley. And in fact, in one outbreak, 20,000 people died. So over the next 25 years, work was undertaken by Carlos Finlay in Cuba to elucidate the mode of transmission of yellow fever. And he suggested that a biting insect was responsible, and he called it Culex cubanensis, which was actually identified as Aedes aegypti. And he actually identified the extrinsic incubation period. And the extrinsic incubation period in mosquito-borne or insect-borne diseases is the period from when the insect sucks up the pathogen to when it is able to transmit it. So he discovered that in mosquitoes. Then in 1898, Spain and Portugal had a meeting, and they decided to split where they had decided to split the Americas and stuff between Portugal and Spain. Spain decided now it was time to renounce all its colonies. And in 1900, the US sent a yellow fever commission to Havana in order to sort out the yellow fever in Cuba for commercial reasons. And the members were Major Walter Reed, and he's got quite a few things named after him in America. James Carroll, Aristides Abramonte, and Jesse. Now, I think it's Lazor. Google said it rhymes with razor, but I don't know if that's true. Okay, so, and he was tasked, the commission was tasked with giving special attention to the questions relating to etiology and prevention of yellow fever. But at that time, no mosquito investigation was thought of. And then they did a whole lot of experiments with volunteers from the US forces. And it's cited as one of the first examples of informed consent, although I think people would argue. I think people would argue.
Conflicts of interest.
People would argue against that. And what they would do is take a mosquito that had fed on a known infected patient and let it bite. They would suck it up in a tube and let it bite a non-infected volunteer and see whether they got yellow fever. And a lot of times they would. But just out of interest, the star or the door, he actually died doing these experiments because a mosquito alighted on his hand, which he saw. And he decided to let it feed as opposed to brushing it away. And as a result, because he thought he had been seasoned, and as a result, he died of yellow fever. So this was all addressing the urban cycle of yellow fever. It didn't address the sylvatic cycle, and that really remained largely unknown. So then, what were the benefits of this new knowledge? Well, in 1901, William Gordis cleared Havana. He was first sent to Havana, and he cleared Havana city of yellow fever. And then from 1904 to 1914, like I said before, he went to the area where they wanted to build the Panama Canal. And he cleared that of mosquitoes, mainly using fumigation, netting, and DDT and sanitation of mosquito breeding sites. So he knocked out malaria and he knocked out yellow fever. In 1927, they found out that it was a filterable agent that was causing yellow fever, and that's the virologists will know, but it's literally where you take a porcelain filter which the holes are too small for bacteria, and you pass your thing through it, and what's left is your virus, but they didn't call them viruses then. And so quite soon after that, in 1930, Max Theiler developed a vaccine which he had got from the blood of a patient in Ghana called the CB. And it's the CB vaccine, which is also called the 17D vaccine, which is still the vaccine we use today. They also discovered the sylvatic cycle, and in the 1970s, vertical transmission for yellow fever was described. And you can see this is just a post from the 1900s when Gorgas was there from Harper's. It's a political cartoon. And you can see Uncle Sam is pointing to a mountain which says Yellow Jack, which is the name for yellow fever. And I kept thinking of Donald Trump wanting to take back the Panama Canal when I was doing all of this. I suppose he thinks Americans did most of the work. And so lastly, we then get to modern times and how is our fight against malaria? Well, you know, it's ongoing. Many countries, including our own, are trying to eliminate malaria. I don't know how successful it will ever be, just due to our porous borders. But we have one foe in the fight against malaria, and that's Anopheles stevensii, which is a new mosquito which came from India. And it's been reported as far west as Nigeria. And Anopheles stevensii is bad news because it's not crepuscular, so it bites during the day. And it's a very good vector, and it's immune to DDT. So it's quite a scary mosquito to have around. And then,
Sorry, just
yes,
with that.
yes.
Had its bridge across the continents, is that because of climate change or just human movement?
I think it might be human movement. Going from Kenya to, because I can't think of much. It's like in the same bag.
Yeah.
But I don't actually know.
Did it go that way or the other way? Because normally malaria travels from Asia into Africa, not from Africa into Asia.
I think it went from Asia into Africa, into like Kenya, and then hopped over to Nigeria. Yeah.
To be followed in my talk on climate change.
So that'll be interesting. So, and then just yellow fever, this I got from the World Health Bulletin from 2023 though, from 2024. Just looking at outbreaks, you can see we still have yellow fever in Central Africa and in quite a large part of the South American continent. And that's why we can't entirely do away with our yellow fever vaccines. And there've been some large outbreaks in Nigeria. And remember, the one I remember was a few years ago, they had one in Brasilia of urban yellow fever, which was quite bad as well. And so, just my take-home messages are that mosquitoes have evolved and lived with us over thousands of years, and mass movement conflict leads to increase in mosquito numbers and hence disease. New mosquito threats are emerging, and is eradication possible? I mean, our government would say yes by 2030. I think it is, but I don't. The goalposts keep on moving. And just lastly, out of interest, this is a clay tablet from 2000 BCE, where the Babylonians, in their writing, the cuneiform and whatnot, there are spells against mosquitoes.
Sure.